You're defective, Sarah. I married you to build a family, not to care for a broken woman." The divorce papers were still warm in her hands when Sarah Mitchell realized she had nowhere to go. Cast out into a December snowstorm for being defective, she was about to discover that sometimes being thrown away is exactly what leads you home. What happened that frozen night in Chicago would shatter every rule about how families are supposed to form. When a single-father CEO spotted a desperate woman at a bus stop, his simple act of kindness would prove that the most broken moments often create the most beautiful beginnings. This is the story of a woman who was told she wasn't enough and the family who showed her she was everything they'd been missing. Before we continue, please tell us where in the world are you tuning in from? We love seeing how far our stories travel. The fluorescent lights in Dr. Peterson's office hummed with the same cold indifference that Sarah Mitchell had grown accustomed to over the past 4 years. She sat in the familiar leather chair, her hands folded tightly in her lap, watching the doctor's face as he delivered what she already knew would be devastating news. "I'm sorry," Sarah. Dr. Peterson said, his voice carrying the practiced gentleness of someone who'd delivered this particular heartbreak countless times before. "The latest tests confirm what we suspected. The endometriosis has progressed significantly. Natural conception is, well, it's virtually impossible at this point." The words hung in the sterile air like a death sentence. Sarah felt something inside her chest crack open, a wound that had been festering for years, finally splitting wide. She'd known this day was coming. The pain had been getting worse, the treatments less effective, the hope dimmer with each passing month. "What about IVR?" she asked quietly, though she already knew what Vincent would say about the cost, about the low success rates, about throwing good money after bad. Given the severity of the scarring, even that would have less than a 5% chance of success. Dr. Peterson explained, his fingers steepled as he leaned forward with what was meant to be compassionate directness, and the financial investment would be substantial, with no guarantee of results. Sarah nodded mechanically, her mind already racing ahead to the conversation she'd have to have with her husband. Vincent Crawford had built his real estate empire on calculated risks and guaranteed returns. He didn't invest in lost causes, and that's exactly what she'd become. 20 minutes later, Sarah sat in her BMW in the clinic parking lot, staring at the official report that would end her marriage. 4 years of trying, of hoping, of enduring Vincent's increasingly cold silences when another month passed without conception. 4 years of watching him grow distant and irritated when she couldn't deliver the one thing he'd married her for. Her phone buzzed. Vincent's name flashed on the screen. "Did you get the results?" His voice was clipped businesslike, the same tone he used with underperforming employees. "Yes." Sarah whispered, her throat tight. "Dr. Peterson says natural conception is virtually impossible now. The endometriosis has—" "I don't need the medical details," Vincent interrupted. "Can you have children or not?" The brutal simplicity of the question stripped away any illusion Sarah had been harboring about their marriage. Not "how are you feeling?" or "what are our options?" Just the bottom line, delivered with the emotional warmth of a quarterly earnings report. Not naturally, no. "But Vincent, there are other options. Adoption, or we could try. I need you home in an hour," Vincent said, his voice now carrying an edge that made Sarah's stomach clench. "We need to talk." The line went dead. Sarah sat in the parking lot as snow began to fall, watching other women emerge from the clinic. Some looked hopeful, clutching ultrasound photos. Others looked as devastated as she felt. But they all had one thing in common. They were going home to partners who would hold them, comfort them, face whatever came next together. Sarah was going home to Vincent Crawford, who measured love in terms of return on investment, and she had just become a liability. The drive through Chicago's December traffic gave her time to rehearse what she might say, how she might convince him that their marriage was about more than reproduction. But even as she practiced the words, she knew they would fall on deaf ears. Vincent had never loved her, not really. He'd loved the idea of her young, beautiful, from a good family, perfect for producing the heirs he needed to carry on his legacy. She pulled into the circular driveway of their Lincoln Park mansion, a monument to Vincent's success that had always felt more like a mausoleum than a home. The house was beautiful, impressive, and utterly without warmth, much like their marriage. Vincent was waiting in his study, standing behind his mahogany desk, like a judge preparing to deliver a verdict. His sandy brown hair was perfectly styled, his expensive suit wrinkle-free despite the long day. Everything about him screamed success, control, perfection. Everything she was not. "Sit down, Sarah," he said without looking up from the papers spread across his desk. She remained standing. Something in his tone, in the formal arrangement of the room, told her this wasn't going to be a discussion about their future. This was going to be a termination. "I've been thinking about this for months," Vincent began, his voice steady and cold. "Ever since Dr. Peterson mentioned that the condition was progressive. I've consulted with my lawyer, and I think it's best if we end this marriage now, before we waste any more time on a situation that clearly isn't going to improve." Sarah felt the floor shift beneath her feet. "Vincent, we've only been trying for 4 years. Lots of couples take longer, and there are so many options now." "I don't want options." Vincent's voice cut through her, pleading like a blade. "I want biological children, my children. I want a wife who can give me a family, not someone I have to take care of like an invalid." The words hit her like physical blows. "I'm not an invalid. I have a medical condition that makes you incapable of fulfilling the basic function of a wife." Vincent finally looked at her, his pale blue eyes completely devoid of warmth or empathy. "I've already filed the papers. The marriage is over, Sarah. I need you to pack your things and leave." The silence that followed was deafening. 4 years of marriage, 8 years together, dismissed in less than 5 minutes. No discussion, no counseling, no attempt to find alternatives. Just a cold corporate decision delivered without a trace of emotion. When Sarah asked, her voice barely above a whisper, Tonight. I don't want to drag this out unnecessarily." "Tonight," Sarah's voice rose in panic. "Vincent, it's December. It's snowing. Where am I supposed to go?" Vincent shrugged, already turning his attention back to his papers. "That's not my concern anymore. You're a grown woman. Figure it out." Sarah stared at him. This man she'd shared a bed with for 4 years, who had once promised to love her in sickness and in health. The stranger behind the desk bore no resemblance to the charming man who'd swept her off her feet when she was 25 and working as a receptionist at his company. "I gave up everything for you," Sarah said, finding her voice again. "My job, my friends, my independence. I organized your life, hosted your parties, smiled at your clients. I've been a good wife, Vincent." "You've been an adequate wife," Vincent corrected without looking up. "But I need more than adequate. I need functional. And you're not." The cruelty of it took Sarah's breath away. She'd known Vincent was ambitious, driven, sometimes ruthlessly practical. But she'd never imagined he was capable of this level of coldness. "Where am I supposed to go?" she asked again, hating the desperation in her voice. "Call your cousin, stay at a hotel, find a shelter." "I honestly don't care, Sarah. This isn't my problem anymore. I don't have money for a hotel. You know that. I haven't worked in 4 years." Vincent reached into his desk drawer and pulled out a thin envelope. "There's $1,500 in cash. That should be enough to get you settled somewhere temporarily." $1,500. 4 years of marriage reduced to $1,500 in an envelope like severance pay for a terminated employee. Sarah took the envelope with numb fingers. "You're really doing this? You're actually throwing me away like garbage because I can't have children." "I'm making a practical decision based on irreconcilable differences," Vincent said, his voice taking on the tone he used in depositions. "Our goals are no longer compatible." Sarah laughed, a bitter sound that surprised even her. "Our goals? I didn't know. Love had goals, Vincent. I thought it was supposed to be unconditional." "Love is a luxury I can't afford," Vincent replied. "I have a legacy to build, a business to pass down. I need a wife who can help me with that, not hold me back. Not hold. And what about for better or worse, in sickness and in health? You're not sick, Sarah. You're broken. There's a difference." The finality in his voice told Sarah that no amount of pleading or reasoning would change his mind. Vincent Crawford had made his decision with the same cold calculation he brought to every business deal, and she was just another asset to be liquidated. "I'll need 2 hours to pack," Sarah said quietly, her pride finally overriding her desperation. "Fine, but I want you gone before 7. I have dinner plans." Of course he did, probably with the young associate from his firm, who'd been making increasingly frequent appearances at company events, the one with the bright smile and the obvious fertility that Sarah could never compete with. Sarah walked out of Vincent's study and up the stairs to what had been their bedroom, her legs feeling disconnected from her body. 2 hours to pack up 4 years of marriage, to gather the pieces of a life that had just been declared worthless. She moved mechanically, throwing clothes into the worn duffel bag she'd brought to the marriage. Most of her belongings were gifts from Vincent, chosen to reflect his taste rather than hers. She left them behind, taking only what was truly hers. A few changes of clothes, the photograph of her parents who'd died in a car accident 6 years ago, and the wedding ring that now felt like a shackle around her finger. As she packed, snow continued to fall outside the bedroom window, covering the city in a blanket of white that would have been beautiful under different circumstances. But all Sarah could think about was how cold it was going to be, and how utterly alone she was in the world. At exactly 7 o'clock, Vincent appeared in the doorway of their bedroom, car keys jingling in his hand. Sarah was sitting on the edge of the bed, her packed duffel bag at her feet, staring at the room that had been her sanctuary for 4 years. "Time's up," he said without a trace of sympathy in his voice. Sarah stood slowly, slinging the bag over her shoulder. It contained everything she owned now. 3 changes of clothes, a few toiletries, the photograph of her parents, and the divorce papers Vincent had handed her on her way upstairs. Her entire life reduced to what could fit in a bag meant for weekend trips. "My car," she asked quietly, "is in my name. You can take the L or call a cab." Of course. Sarah had been so focused on becoming the perfect wife that she'd allowed Vincent to put everything in his name for tax purposes. The car, the credit cards, even her small savings account had been transferred to his management. She'd trusted him completely, and now that trust had left her with nothing but the cash in the envelope and whatever was in her personal checking account, maybe $800 total. Vincent didn't offer to drive her anywhere, didn't ask where she was planning to go. He simply stood there waiting for her to leave so he could get on with his evening plans. Sarah walked through the house one last time, past the formal dining room where she'd hosted countless business dinners, past the kitchen where she'd tried so hard to create the warm family atmosphere Vincent claimed to want, past the living room with its designer furniture that was beautiful but impossible to actually live in. At the front door, she turned back to look at Vincent one more time. He was already on his phone, probably calling his dinner date to confirm their plans. 4 years of marriage, and he couldn't even spare 5 minutes to see her safely out into the snow. "Vincent," she said softly. He looked up, irritated at the interruption. "I hope whoever you find next gives you everything you're looking for." For just a moment, something flickered across his face. Regret, maybe, or just annoyance that she was making this more difficult than it needed to be. "Goodbye, Sarah," he said, already turning away. The door closed behind her with a soft click that sounded like the end of everything. The December air hit her like a physical assault. She'd been so focused on packing that she'd forgotten to grab a winter coat, and the thin wool dress she was wearing offered no protection against the wind that whipped through Lincoln Park. Snow was falling steadily now. Thick flakes that blurred the streetlights and made the expensive neighborhood look like a Christmas card. Beautiful if you were watching from inside a warm house. Sarah pulled out her phone and scrolled through her limited contact list. Her cousin Lisa was in Prague for another 2 weeks. Her college roommate had moved to Seattle and started a new life that didn't include old friends. The few acquaintances she'd made as Vincent's wife weren't really her friends. They were part of his social circle, and she doubted any of them would want to get involved in divorce drama. She called 3 different women's shelters, standing on Vincent's front steps as snow accumulated on her shoulders. All 3 were full with waiting lists that stretched for weeks. The closest available bed was in a facility 40 minutes south of the city, and they couldn't guarantee it would still be open by the time she arrived. A hotel, then. But even the cheapest places she could find online were $80 a night, and that was before taxes and deposits. Her $1,500 might stretch for 2 weeks if she was careful, but then what? She had no job, no references that weren't connected to Vincent, no skills beyond organizing social events and managing a household. The irony wasn't lost on her. She'd spent 4 years learning to be the perfect wife, and now those were the only skills she had. Skills that were worthless without a husband to apply them to. Sarah started walking toward the nearest L station, her thin shoes slipping on the increasingly icy sidewalks. The duffel bag felt like it weighed 100 pounds, and the cold was seeping through her dress, making her muscles ache and her joints stiff. The train station was warm at least, and Sarah bought a day pass with some of her precious cash. She had no destination in mind, just a desperate need to get out of Lincoln Park before someone Vincent knew saw her, and reported back that his ex-wife was wandering the streets like a homeless person, which she realized with growing panic was exactly what she was. Sarah rode the train aimlessly for 2 hours, watching the city pass by outside the frosted windows. Families headed home from holiday shopping. Couples holding hands, children pressed against the glass, pointing at the snow. Everyone had somewhere to go, someone waiting for them. Everyone except her. When the train reached the end of the line, Sarah got off and found herself in an unfamiliar neighborhood on the north side. The area was middle-class family-oriented, with small houses and tree-lined streets that looked nothing like Vincent's upscale enclave. It was the kind of neighborhood she'd dreamed of living in when she was younger, before she'd been swept away by Vincent's wealth and sophistication. The bus stop was just a simple shelter with a bench and a posted schedule, but at least it offered some protection from the wind. Sarah settled onto the cold metal bench and pulled out her phone to check the bus times. The last bus had left 20 minutes ago. The next one wouldn't arrive until 6 a.m. Sarah stared at the schedule in disbelief. She was stranded in a neighborhood she didn't know, with nowhere to go and no one to call. The temperature was dropping, and the snow was falling harder now, driven by a wind that cut through her thin dress like knives. She tried calling cab companies, but the wait times were over 2 hours due to the weather. Uber and Lyft were surging to prices she couldn't afford. Even if she could get a ride, where would she tell them to take her? Sarah pulled her knees to her chest and wrapped her arms around herself, trying to conserve body heat. The bus shelter offered some protection from the snow, but not from the cold that was seeping into her bones. Her feet were already going numb, and her hands were shaking too badly to operate her phone properly. She thought about her parents who'd died when she was 22. They'd loved her unconditionally, supported her dreams, believed she could do anything she set her mind to. They'd never lived to see her marry Vincent, never saw her gradually disappear into his shadow, until she forgot who she was without him. What would they think of her now? Their daughter reduced to shivering in a bus shelter because she'd trusted the wrong man with her entire future. The snow kept falling, and Sarah kept getting colder. She could feel her thinking becoming sluggish, her movements less coordinated. She'd read about hypothermia, knew that drowsiness was one of the warning signs. But she couldn't seem to make herself get up, couldn't figure out where to go or what to do next. Maybe this was how it ended. Maybe Vincent was right, and she really was broken beyond repair. Maybe it was easier to just sit here and let the cold make the decision for her. Sarah closed her eyes and listened to the wind howl through the bare branches above the bus shelter. In the distance, she could hear the sounds of the city cars passing, doors closing, families settling in for the night. Normal people living normal lives, safe and warm and loved. She'd wanted so desperately to be normal, to be the wife Vincent needed to give him the children he wanted to create the family they'd both dreamed of. But her body had betrayed her, and now she was paying the ultimate price for that betrayal. The cold was making her drowsy now, and Sarah found herself drifting in and out of consciousness. She was vaguely aware that this was dangerous, that she needed to stay awake, but it was so much easier to just close her eyes and pretend that when she woke up, none of this would be real. The sound of children's laughter drifted through Sarah's semi-conscious haze, pulling her back to awareness. She opened her eyes to find herself slumped against the bus shelter's plexiglass wall, her body shivering uncontrollably. The laughter belonged to a family walking past on the sidewalk, bundled in warm coats and holding hands as they navigated the snowy street. Sarah tried to sit up straighter and immediately regretted it. Her muscles had stiffened from the cold, and moving sent sharp pains through her back and neck. Her feet were completely numb now, and her hands were so cold she could barely feel her fingers. The phone in her lap showed 11:47 p.m., which meant she'd been sitting here for nearly 3 hours. 3 hours in 8-degree weather, wearing nothing but a thin wool dress and inadequate shoes. 3 hours of watching her breath form clouds in the frigid air, of feeling her body temperature drop degree by degree, of coming to terms with the fact that Vincent Crawford had quite possibly sentenced her to death. The irony was bitter. After years of struggling with fertility, of feeling like her body was failing her, she was now facing the very real possibility that it might fail her in an entirely different way. She'd survived the endometriosis, the failed treatments, the monthly heartbreak of negative pregnancy tests, only to potentially freeze to death because her husband had decided she wasn't worth keeping warm. Sarah fumbled for her phone again, her numb fingers struggling to unlock the screen. Maybe she'd missed a call back from one of the shelters. Maybe there was a late-night crisis line she could call. Maybe there was some resource she hadn't thought of yet. But as she scrolled through her contacts, the truth became unavoidable. There was no one. In 4 years of marriage to Vincent, she'd allowed herself to become completely isolated. The friends she'd had before marriage had gradually fallen away, victims of Vincent's subtle but persistent campaign to keep her world small and manageable. He'd discouraged her from maintaining close friendships, suggesting that her time was better spent supporting his career and their shared future. Now she understood why. Isolated women were easier to discard. Sarah's cousin Lisa had been her last real connection to her old life, but Lisa was halfway around the world and wouldn't be back for weeks. Even if she were here, Sarah wasn't sure she'd want to burden her with this mess. Lisa had her own life, her own problems, and Sarah's situation was hardly the kind of crisis anyone would want to inherit. The cold was making it hard to think clearly. Sarah's thoughts kept drifting, memories mixing with present reality in a way that should have alarmed her, but instead felt oddly comforting. She remembered being a little girl building snow forts with her parents in their backyard. Her mother's hands always warm, rubbing feeling back into her cold fingers after hours of winter play. Her father's voice calling her inside for hot chocolate and grilled cheese sandwiches. They'd loved her unconditionally. Her father had never made her feel like her worth was tied to what she could produce or achieve. Her mother had never suggested that Sarah's value as a woman depended on her ability to bear children. They'd simply loved her for who she was, supported her dreams, and believed in her potential. If they were alive now, they'd be horrified by what she'd allowed herself to become. They'd raised her to be strong, independent, capable of standing on her own. Instead, she'd willingly given up every piece of her autonomy to become Vincent's perfect accessory. A car drove past, its headlights sweeping across the bus shelter, and for a moment Sarah's heart lifted. Maybe someone would stop. Maybe someone would offer help. But the car continued on its taillights, disappearing into the snowy night. Of course, who would stop for a stranger at a bus stop at midnight? It wasn't safe, it wasn't smart, and it wasn't anyone else's responsibility to rescue her from the consequences of her own poor choices. Sarah's vision was starting to blur around the edges, and she recognized this as another warning sign. Her body was shutting down non-essential functions to preserve core temperature, but there wasn't much left to preserve. She needed to do something, needed to move, needed to find warmth, but the options were becoming increasingly limited. She could try walking to find an all-night business, but she wasn't sure her legs would support her, and the risk of collapsing in the snow seemed worse than staying put. She could call 911, but the embarrassment of being picked up as a public nuisance felt overwhelming, and she wasn't sure ambulance services were free. The divorce papers in her bag seemed to mock her. Vincent had been so efficient, so thorough in his calculations. He'd given her just enough money to avoid looking completely heartless, but not enough to actually rebuild her life. He'd timed the eviction perfectly on a night when shelters were full and weather was dangerous, ensuring that she'd have no good options. Maybe that was the point. Maybe Vincent was hoping she'd disappear quietly, permanently, so he wouldn't have to deal with alimony or the messy complications of a bitter ex-wife. Maybe this was his final solution to the problem of Sarah Mitchell Crawford. Sarah closed her eyes again, feeling the drowsiness pull at her consciousness. It would be so easy to just let go, to stop fighting the cold and the exhaustion and the crushing weight of her situation. She'd tried so hard to be what Vincent wanted to fit into his vision of the perfect life, and all it had earned her was this frozen bus stop and a death that no one would mourn. But somewhere in the back of her mind, her parents' voices were calling her home. Not to the mansion she'd just left, but to the warm kitchen of her childhood, to the unconditional love that had shaped her before Vincent's conditional love had broken her. They hadn't raised her to give up. They'd raised her to fight to survive, to believe in her own worth even when no one else did. Sarah forced her eyes open and tried to straighten up again. She wasn't dead yet, and as long as she was breathing, there was still hope, even if that hope was as fragile and fleeting as her rapidly fading body heat. David Harrison's Italian leather shoes crunched against the salt-stained sidewalk as he walked through Chicago's Lincoln Park neighborhood, his twin daughters flanking him like small bodyguards. At 34, David had learned to navigate single parenthood with the same meticulous attention to detail that had made Harrison Tech Solutions one of the city's fastest-growing companies. Every evening routine was precisely planned. Every potential crisis had a backup solution. Tonight's plan had been simple dinner at Romano's to celebrate closing the Peterson account, then home for bath story time and bed by 9. But Lily and Rose Harrison, 8 years old and possessing their late mother's gift for beautiful disruption, had other ideas. "Daddy, can we walk home instead of taking the car?" Lily had asked as they'd left the restaurant. "The snow is so pretty and we hardly ever get to walk at night." "Please, please, please," Rose had added, bouncing on her toes with excitement. "We have our warm coats and it's not that far." David had hesitated. His Mercedes was parked in the restaurant's valet lot, warm and safe and efficient. Walking meant adding 30 minutes to their evening routine, meant risking wet feet and runny noses, meant deviating from the schedule that kept their lives running smoothly. But then he'd looked at his daughters' faces bright with anticipation and wonder at the falling snow, and remembered Rebecca's voice. "Let them be children, David. The schedules and plans can wait." Rebecca. 2 years since the accident, and her presence still guided his decisions, still whispered wisdom in his ear during moments of uncertainty. She would have said yes to the walk without hesitation. "All right," David had agreed, watching his daughters' faces light up with joy. "But we stay together, and if anyone gets too cold, we're calling a cab." Now they were 15 minutes into the walk home, and David was second-guessing his decision. The snow was falling harder than it had been when they'd left the restaurant, and the temperature was dropping fast. His breath formed clouds in the frigid air, and despite their winter coats, both girls were starting to slow down. "How much further?" Daddy Rose asked, her small voice muffled by the purple scarf wrapped around her neck. "Just a few more blocks, sweetheart," David replied, adjusting his grip on the briefcase that contained his life contracts, proposals, and the portable office that allowed him to be both present father and successful CEO. "Are you getting too cold?" a little Lily admitted, pressing closer to his side. "But I still like walking in the snow." David smiled, feeling the familiar tug of love and worry that defined his existence as a single parent. These two girls were his entire world, the reason he got up every morning, and the purpose behind every decision he made. Since Rebecca's death, they'd been healing together, learning to be a family of 3 instead of 4, figuring out how to honor her memory while still moving forward. It hadn't been easy. Those first months had been a blur of grief and confusion, of trying to be strong for his daughters while falling apart inside. Rebecca had been the heart of their family, the one who made their house feel like a home, who knew exactly what each girl needed before they even asked. David had learned through trial and error, through tearful bedtimes and burnt dinners, through middle-of-the-night comfort sessions, and the slow realization that love could be enough even when it felt inadequate. "Daddy, look!" Lily said suddenly, pointing ahead to where a bus stop shelter glowed under a streetlight. "Is that lady waiting for the bus?" David followed her gaze and felt his chest tighten. A woman was sitting alone in the bus shelter, hunched against the plexiglass wall. Even from a distance, he could see she was inadequately dressed for the weather, wearing what looked like a thin dress without any winter coat. The buses stopped running an hour ago. Rose observed with the matter-of-fact wisdom of an 8-year-old who'd learned public transportation schedules out of necessity. Why is she still sitting there? David's steps slowed as they approached the shelter. His years in business had taught him to assess situations quickly, and what he saw made alarm bells ring in his head. The woman was clearly in distress, possibly hypothermic, definitely in danger. Her stillness was the wrong kind of stillness, the kind that spoke of exhaustion or resignation rather than patient waiting. "Girls?" David said quietly, stopping about 10 feet from the shelter. "I want you to stay right here for a minute, okay? Is she in trouble?" Lily asked, her young face creased with concern. "I think she might be," David replied honestly. He'd learned not to lie to his daughters about difficult things. Rebecca's illness and death had taught them all that sometimes life was hard and pretending otherwise didn't protect anyone. David approached the shelter slowly, his businessman's eye taking in details that painted a troubling picture. The woman was young, probably late 20s, with blonde hair that had escaped from what might once have been a careful style. Her dress was expensive but completely inappropriate for winter weather. She had a duffel bag beside her that looked like everything she owned in the world. Most telling was her complete stillness. She wasn't checking her phone, wasn't looking around for an approaching bus, wasn't showing any of the restless energy of someone actively waiting for something. She was just sitting, enduring. "Excuse me," David said gently, not wanting to startle her. "Are you waiting for a bus?" The woman's head lifted slowly, and David felt his heart clench at what he saw. Her face was pale, her lips tinged blue with cold, but it was her eyes that stopped him. They held the hollow look of someone who'd been broken recently and thoroughly. She looked at him with the wary exhaustion of someone who expected nothing good from strangers. "Yes," she said, though her voice shook with cold and something deeper. "Just waiting." David glanced at the posted schedule, confirming what Rose had already observed. "Ma'am, the last bus on this route left over an hour ago. There won't be another one until morning." He watched her face carefully as this information registered, saw the way her shoulders sagged slightly, as if he'd confirmed something she'd been afraid to believe. She wasn't waiting for a bus. She was just waiting. For morning, maybe. Or for something worse. "I'm fine," she said automatically, the reflexive response of someone who'd been taught not to be a burden. "Thank you for your concern." But she wasn't fine. Even David's inexperienced eye could see the signs of hypothermia setting in, the uncontrollable shivering, the sluggish responses, the way she seemed to be moving in slow motion. She was wearing a thin wool dress in 8-degree weather, and she'd been sitting in this shelter for who knew how long. Daddy Lily's voice called from behind him, small and worried. "She's freezing. We should help her." "Emily's right," Rose added, using the special voice she reserved for serious proclamations. "Remember what you always say about helping people who need it." David turned to look at his daughters, these two beautiful souls who'd inherited their mother's enormous capacity for compassion. Rebecca had always said that kindness was the most important thing they could teach the girls, more important than good grades or proper manners or social success. Kindness was what made people human. And right now, kindness meant not walking away from a woman who was clearly in crisis. David approached the shelter again, kneeling down to put himself at eye level with the woman. The businessman in him was calculating risks, stranger danger, the girl's safety, the possibility that this woman might be mentally ill or dangerous. But the father in him, the part that had been shaped by Rebecca's gentle wisdom, knew that sometimes taking care of others was exactly how you took care of your own children. "My name is David Harrison," he said gently. "These are my daughters, Lily and Rose. We live about 6 blocks from here, and I'd like to offer you a warm place to stay tonight, at least until you can figure out your next steps." The woman stared at him as if he'd spoken a foreign language. "I can't accept that," she said automatically. "You don't know me. I could be dangerous." David almost smiled at that. This woman, shivering and vulnerable and clearly at the end of her rope, worried that she might be dangerous to him. "You're sitting in a bus shelter in 8-degree weather without a coat," he said kindly. "The only danger you pose is to yourself." He gestured toward his daughters, who were watching the conversation with the intense focus they brought to everything that mattered. "Look, I understand if you're wary of strangers, but I have 2 children with me which should tell you something about my intentions, and I can't in good conscience walk past someone who clearly needs help." David stood up, extending his hand toward the woman. "So please let us at least get you warm and fed. After that, if you want to leave, I'll call you a cab to wherever you want to go. Deal?" Sarah looked up at the man standing before her, trying to process what he was offering through the fog of cold and exhaustion that had settled over her mind. 6 blocks away was warm shelter, food, safety. 6 blocks away was everything she needed to survive the night. But accepting help from a stranger went against every rule Vincent had drilled into her about safety and propriety. Nice women didn't go home with men they'd just met. They didn't impose on families, didn't create awkward situations, didn't make themselves burdens to people who owed them nothing. Then again, nice women probably also didn't end up freezing to death at bus stops after being discarded like unwanted furniture. "I don't want to impose," Sarah managed, though her teeth were chattering so hard it was difficult to speak clearly. "You have children to think about. You don't need a stranger complicating your evening." The man David, he'd said his name was, knelt down again, bringing himself back to her eye level. There was something about his posture, patient and non-threatening, that reminded her of her father. He had kind eyes, dark brown, and filled with genuine concern, not the calculating assessment she'd grown accustomed to from Vincent. "Let me tell you what I see," David said gently. "I see someone who's in trouble, who's cold and scared and probably hasn't eaten in a while. I see someone who's trying very hard to be brave and self-sufficient, but who needs help right now, whether she wants to admit it or not." He paused, glancing back at his daughters before continuing. "My girls lost their mother 2 years ago. Since then, I've tried to teach them that when we see people in pain, we don't look away. We help if we can. Not because we expect anything in return, but because it's the right thing to do." Sarah felt tears prick her eyes, though they froze almost immediately in the cold air. This stranger was offering her more kindness than her own husband had shown her in months. "I don't have anything to offer you in return," she whispered. "I can't even pay you for the trouble." "I'm not asking for payment," David said firmly. "I'm asking you to let me and my daughters be good people tonight. Let us help someone who needs help. Let us be the kind of family my wife would have been proud of." The mention of his late wife sent another pang through Sarah's chest. Here was a man who'd lost the person he loved most, who was raising 2 children alone, and he was still thinking about how to help a stranger. The contrast with Vincent, who'd cast her aside at the first sign of imperfection, was stark and heartbreaking. "Daddy," one of the little girls called out, her voice high and sweet in the cold air. "Is the lady going to come home with us? Because she's shaking really bad, and I think she needs hot chocolate." "And a warm blanket," the other girl added. "Like when we get cold after playing in the snow." David smiled at his daughters, and Sarah saw the fierce love that passed between them. These weren't just words to him. This was how he was actually raising his children. To notice suffering and respond with compassion. To see strangers as potential friends rather than potential threats. "What do you say?" David asked, turning back to Sarah. "Will you let us help you?" Sarah tried to think of alternatives, tried to come up with any other option that didn't involve accepting charity from strangers. But her mind was sluggish with cold, and the truth was becoming undeniable. She had no other options. She could sit here and freeze, or she could trust this man with kind eyes and compassionate children. "Okay," she whispered the word barely audible above the wind. "Thank you." David's face lit up with relief, and he immediately stood to help her up from the bench. Sarah tried to rise on her own, but her legs were stiff and unsteady from the cold. David caught her elbow as she swayed, his grip firm and reassuring. "Easy," he said gently. "You've been sitting in the cold for a long time. Your body needs a minute to adjust." As soon as Sarah was standing, David began shrugging out of his own coat, an expensive-looking navy peacoat that probably cost more than she'd spent on clothes in the past year. "Here," he said, draping it around her shoulders before she could protest. "You need this more than I do." The coat was warm from his body heat and smelled like expensive cologne and something indefinably masculine. It was so big on her that it hung almost to her knees, but the warmth was immediate and overwhelming. Sarah had forgotten what it felt like to be warm. "But you'll be cold," she protested weakly. "I have a sweater and we're not going far," David assured her. "Besides, I'm not the one who's been sitting outside for 3 hours. 3 hours. Had it really been that long? No wonder she could barely feel her feet or think clearly. 3 hours of slowly freezing while Vincent was probably enjoying his dinner plans, probably not sparing a single thought for the woman he'd discarded. "Can you walk okay?" David asked, studying her face with concern. "We can call a cab if you're not feeling steady." Sarah tested her legs, taking a few tentative steps. They held though she felt shaky and weak. "I think I can manage," she said. "It's not far, right?" 6 blocks, David confirmed. "Girls, come here. Let's all walk together." The 2 little girls approached eagerly, their faces bright with curiosity and excitement. Up close, Sarah could see they were identical twins, with dark hair and their father's brown eyes. They were beautiful children, well-dressed, and obviously well-loved, with the kind of confident sweetness that came from being raised with consistent affection. "I'm Lily," the one in the purple coat announced, falling into step beside Sarah. "And that's Rose. She's exactly 3 minutes older than me, but she's not the boss, even though she thinks she is." "I don't think I'm the boss," Rose protested, taking Sarah's other side. "I just have good ideas and people should listen to them." David laughed, the sound warm and genuine in the cold night air. "They're both bossy," he confided to Sarah. "They get it from their mother." Sarah felt a smile tugging at her lips, despite everything. These children were charming, and their father clearly adored them. It had been so long since she'd been around a happy family that she'd almost forgotten what it looked like. "How old are you?" Lily asked as they began walking through the snow. "I'm 29, Sarah replied, surprised by how strange her own voice sounded. When was the last time someone had asked her questions about herself? When was the last time anyone had been curious about who she was, rather than what she could do for them? "That's really old," Rose observed matter-of-factly. "But not as old as Daddy. He's 34, which is practically ancient." "Hey now," David protested, but he was grinning. 34 is the prime of life, thank you very much. What's your name?" Lily asked, apparently fascinated by this new addition to their evening. Sarah hesitated. She'd been Sarah Crawford for 4 years, but Vincent had made it clear that name no longer belonged to her. "Sarah," she said finally. "Sarah Mitchell." Her maiden name felt strange on her tongue after so many years of being Mrs. Crawford. But maybe it was time to remember who she'd been before Vincent had reshaped her into his idea of the perfect wife. "That's a pretty name," Lily declared with the confidence of someone whose opinion mattered. "I like it better than some of the other names people have." "What other names do people have?" David asked, amused. "Well, there's Mrs. Henderson next door, but her name is really Gertrude, which sounds like something you'd name a turtle, Rose explained seriously. And there's Mr. Watson from the grocery store, but his first name is Bartholomew, which is just way too many letters for one person." Sarah found herself laughing. Really laughing for the first time in months. These children were delightful, funny and smart, and completely without guile. They chatted easily as they walked, filling the cold air with warmth and life. "Almost there," David said, pointing to a row of elegant brownstones that lined the quiet street. "The one with the green door." Sarah looked ahead to their destination and felt her breath catch. It was beautiful. A classic Chicago brownstone with warm lights glowing in the windows and a small front garden that probably bloomed with flowers in the spring. It looked like a home in the truest sense of the word, like a place where people loved each other and felt safe. It looked like everything she'd dreamed of having with Vincent, everything she'd thought they were building together before her body had failed to cooperate with his plans. "Here we are," David announced, leading them up the front steps. Home sweet home. The warmth hit Sarah like a physical embrace as soon as David opened the front door. After hours in the bitter cold, the heated air felt almost tropical against her skin, and she had to stop in the entryway to let her body adjust to the sudden change in temperature. "Welcome to our house," Lily announced proudly, hanging her purple coat on one of several small hooks by the door. "It's not as big as some houses, but Daddy says it's just the right size for us." Sarah looked around the entryway and felt something loosen in her chest. This was what a real home looked like. The walls were painted in warm, earthy colors, and every surface showed evidence of the life that happened here. Small mittens drying on a radiator, children's artwork taped to the walls, a basket of library books waiting to be read. It was the opposite of Vincent's mansion, where every object had been chosen for its aesthetic value rather than its meaning. Here things were chosen for love. "Let me take your coat," David said gently, helping Sarah out of his peacoat. "And let's get you something warm to drink. Coffee, tea, hot chocolate." Hot chocolate Rose chimed in before Sarah could answer. "It's the best medicine for being cold. Daddy, can we have some too?" Of course, David agreed, leading Sarah toward the kitchen. "But first, let's get our guest some dry clothes. She's been sitting in the snow, and that dress must be soaked." Sarah looked down and realized he was right. The hem of her dress was wet and clinging to her legs, and her thin stockings were damp and probably ruined. She'd been so focused on the cold that she hadn't even noticed how uncomfortable she was. "I have some clothes in my bag," she said quickly, not wanting to impose any further. "I'm sure you do," David said kindly. "But let me grab you something warm to change into first. Something dry and comfortable. I think I still have some of Rebecca's things that would fit you." The casual mention of his late wife's name made Sarah's heart clench. This man was offering her his dead wife's clothes, sharing the most precious remnants of the woman he'd loved. The generosity of it was overwhelming. "Are you sure?" Sarah asked, her voice barely above a whisper. David paused, and for a moment something flickered across his face. Pain, maybe, or the echo of old grief. Then his expression gentled again. "Rebecca would want them to be helping someone who needed help," he said simply. "She was always giving her clothes away to women who needed them more than she did. I think she'd be happy knowing they were still serving that purpose." He disappeared upstairs while the twins led Sarah into the kitchen, chattering about hot chocolate and the proper ratio of marshmallows to cocoa. The kitchen was gorgeous in its lived-in warmth, honey-colored cabinets, a farmhouse sink, and a large table that clearly served as homework, central art station, and family meeting place all in one. "Daddy's really good at making hot chocolate," Lily informed Sarah, climbing onto one of the high stools at the kitchen island. "He learned from YouTube after Mommy died because she used to make it, and we didn't want to stop having it just because she couldn't make it anymore." The matter-of-fact way Lily spoke about her mother's death caught Sarah off guard. There was sadness there, but also acceptance, and the kind of resilience that came from being loved through grief rather than protected from it. "Your mommy sounds like she was wonderful," Sarah said softly. "She was," Rose agreed. "She used to sing while she cooked, and she made the best chocolate chip cookies in the whole world. Daddy tried to make them once, but they were terrible." "They weren't terrible," Lily protested loyally. "They were just different. They were hockey pucks," Rose corrected with devastating honesty. "But we ate them anyway because Daddy tried so hard." David reappeared with an armful of soft-looking clothes, and Sarah caught him smiling at his daughter's conversation. "Are you telling Sarah about my failed baking experiments?" he asked. "We're telling her about Mommy," Lily said, "and also about your terrible cookies. Fair enough?" David laughed. "Here, Sarah. There's a bathroom just down the hall where you can change. Take your time." The clothes he handed her were beautiful and expensive. A soft cashmere sweater in deep blue, a pair of dark jeans that looked barely worn and thick, cozy socks that felt like heaven against her cold skin. Everything fit perfectly, as if Rebecca had been exactly her size. When Sarah looked at herself in the bathroom mirror, she barely recognized the woman staring back. The expensive clothes made her look put together and cared for in a way she hadn't felt in months. But more than that, she looked warm, safe, like someone who belonged somewhere. When she returned to the kitchen, David had 3 mugs of hot chocolate, waiting topped with whipped cream and a sprinkle of cinnamon. The smell alone was enough to make Sarah's mouth water, and she realized she couldn't remember the last time she'd eaten a proper meal. "Careful, it's hot," David warned, sliding a mug across the counter to her. Sarah wrapped her hands around the warm ceramic and felt tears prick her eyes. Such a simple thing, a hot drink in a warm kitchen with kind people, but after the day she'd had it felt like a miracle. "Thank you," she said, though the words felt inadequate for everything he was giving her. "You're welcome," David replied, and she could tell he meant it. Not just the polite response people gave automatically, but a genuine welcome into his home and his family's evening. The hot chocolate was perfect, rich and sweet, and warming her from the inside out. As she drank it, Sarah felt her body finally beginning to relax, the tension of cold and fear slowly leaving her muscles. "Are you hungry?" David asked, studying her face with the kind of attention that suggested he was good at reading people. "When did you last eat?" Sarah tried to think. Breakfast had been a piece of toast eaten standing in Vincent's kitchen while he'd made phone calls and ignored her presence. Had there been lunch? She couldn't remember. "I'm not sure," she admitted. "This morning, maybe?" David's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, and Sarah saw anger flash across his features. Not at her, but at whatever circumstances had led to her sitting at a bus stop, hungry and cold and alone. "Right?" he said briskly. "Food first, then we can figure out everything else." He moved around the kitchen with practiced efficiency, assembling what looked like enough sandwiches to feed a small army. Turkey and cheese with fresh bread cut diagonally, the way her mother used to do it, served with chips and sliced apples, and another mug of hot chocolate. Sarah ate like she was starving, which she supposed she was. Everything tasted incredible, and she had to force herself to slow down and eat like a civilized person instead of wolfing down everything on her plate. The twins chatted throughout the impromptu meal, telling her about school and their friends and the art projects they were working on. They included her in their conversation, effortlessly asking her opinion about whether purple or blue was better for painting flowers, and whether she thought their teacher was right, that cursive writing was still important. It was such a normal family dinner conversation, the kind Sarah had dreamed of having someday. But she'd never imagined she'd be experiencing it as a charity case, rescued from freezing to death by strangers who owed her nothing. "Okay, girls," David said. When the sandwiches were gone, and the twins were starting to yawn over their hot chocolate. "Time for baths and bed. Say goodnight to Sarah." "Do you have to leave, Lily?" asked, looking disappointed. "Can't you stay for stories?" Sarah looked at David uncertainly. She hadn't thought about what came next, about whether this was just a meal and a warm-up before he called her a cab to wherever charity cases went for the night. "Sarah is going to stay tonight," David said firmly, making the decision without consulting her. "She'll be here in the morning, so you can see her then." Both girls brightened immediately. "Really?" Rose asked. "You're going to sleep over?" "If that's okay," Sarah said quietly, looking at David for confirmation. "More than okay," David assured her. "We have a guest room, and you clearly need a safe place to rest. We can talk about next steps tomorrow when you've had time to recover." After the twins had thundered upstairs for their evening routine, David led Sarah to a small but comfortable guest room on the first floor. It had a queen bed with soft-looking linens, a reading chair by the window, and the same warm, welcoming atmosphere as the rest of the house. "There's an ensuite bathroom," David explained, "and extra blankets in the closet if you get cold. Are you comfortable? Do you need anything else?" Sarah looked around the room, so different from the cold perfection of Vincent's mansion, and felt something break open in her chest. "I don't know how to thank you," she whispered. "I don't know how to repay this kindness." "You don't need to repay anything. David said gently. Just rest. Just be safe and warm. That's enough. He paused at the doorway, his hand on the light switch. Sarah. Whatever happened to you today, whatever brought you to that bus stop, it's not the end of your story. I hope you know that. After he left, Sarah sat on the edge of the soft bed and finally allowed herself to cry. Not the desperate tears she'd shed at the bus stop, but something deeper and more complex. Grief for her marriage. Relief at being safe, gratitude for unexpected kindness, and underneath it all the first tiny spark of something that might eventually become hope. Sarah woke to the sound of children's laughter drifting through the guest room door, followed by the rich aroma of coffee and something that smelled like pancakes. For a moment she lay still in the unfamiliar bed, trying to orient herself. Soft sheets, warm room, the absence of any demand to get up and serve someone else's needs. Then yesterday's events came flooding back: Vincent's cold dismissal, the divorce papers, the hours spent freezing at the bus stop, and finally David Harrison's unexpected rescue. She was safe, warm, and for the first time in months she'd slept through the night without waking to Vincent's restless movement or the anxiety that had become her constant companion. The bedside clock showed 7:30 a.m., and Sarah could hear movement throughout the house. The morning routine of a family getting ready for the day. She should get up, get dressed, get out of their way. She'd imposed enough on these kind strangers. A soft knock on the door interrupted her thoughts. "Sarah, are you awake?" David's voice was gentle, respectful. "Breakfast is ready if you'd like to join us. No pressure, though. You can sleep as long as you need." "I'm awake," Sarah called back, sitting up and finger-combing her hair. "I'll be right out." She found her way to the kitchen, following the sounds of family breakfast and the increasingly delicious smells. David stood at the stove, expertly flipping pancakes while carrying on a conversation with his daughters about their plans for the day. He was dressed in dark jeans and a soft grey sweater, looking every inch the successful businessman, even in casual weekend clothes. Sarah Lily bounced in her chair with excitement. "Daddy made pancakes. They're shaped like flowers, but Rose says they look more like alien spaceships." "They do look like spaceships," Rose insisted, pointing at her plate, where several vaguely round pancakes were drowning in syrup. "But that's okay, because spaceships are cool." "Good morning," David said, turning to smile at Sarah. "How did you sleep? Better than I have in months?" Sarah admitted honestly. The guest room had been perfectly quiet and comfortable, a stark contrast to the tension-filled master suite she'd shared with Vincent. "Coffee," David offered, already reaching for a mug. "I'm afraid I only have regular coffee and decaf. The girls haven't converted me to fancy drinks yet." "Regular coffee sounds perfect," Sarah said, accepting the steaming mug gratefully. The coffee was excellent, strong and fresh, and she wrapped her hands around the warm ceramic like an anchor. Sit, David gestured toward the empty chair at the kitchen table. "Pancakes coming right up, and please don't feel like you need to rush off anywhere. It's Saturday, we have nowhere important to be." Sarah settled into the chair next to Lily, who immediately launched into an enthusiastic description of her plans for the day. Art projects playing in the backyard if the snow stopped, and maybe convincing her father to take them to the children's museum. "What do you like to do on Saturdays?" Rose asked Sarah with the direct curiosity of childhood. Sarah paused, trying to remember. What had she done on Saturdays with Vincent? Hosted brunches for his business associates, attended charity events, where she smiled and made small talk while he networked organized social gatherings that served his agenda rather than brought her joy. "I used to like reading," Sarah said slowly, surprised by the memory. "And taking long walks. I used to paint watercolors, though I wasn't very good at it." "Daddy's not good at painting either," Lily said loyally. "But he tries, and that's what matters." David placed a plate of perfectly formed flour pancakes in front of Sarah, and she felt her throat tighten with unexpected emotion. When was the last time someone had made her breakfast? When was the last time someone had cared whether she was hungry or comfortable or happy? "These are beautiful," Sarah said, meaning it. "You didn't have to go to so much trouble." "No trouble," David replied easily. "Saturday morning pancakes are a family tradition." Rebecca started it when the girls were little, and we've kept it going. He said his wife's name naturally without the painful hesitation of fresh grief. There was still love there, still sadness, but also acceptance and the ability to honor her memory while living in the present. Tell me about your mom, Sarah said gently to the twins. She sounds like she was wonderful. Lily and Rose launched into a catalogue of their mother's virtues, her bedtime stories, her chocolate chip cookies, her ability to braid hair into intricate patterns, her tradition of having tea parties on rainy afternoons. She died in a car accident, Rose explained with the matter-of-fact delivery that children used for incomprehensible truths. A man was texting while driving and hit her car. Daddy says it wasn't her fault and it wasn't our fault, and sometimes sad things just happen. But she's still with us in our hearts, Lily added unconsciously, echoing what was clearly a family refrain. And in all the good things she taught us. Sarah felt tears prick her eyes as she watched David's face during his daughter's recitation. He was proud of how they'd processed their loss, how they'd found ways to keep their mother's memory alive while still moving forward. But she could also see the shadow of his own grief, carefully managed and mostly hidden, but still present. Your daddy is very brave, Sarah told the girls. Taking care of you both by himself, making sure you remember your mom, but also helping you be happy. Sometimes he cries, Lily said quietly, when he thinks we're asleep. But that's okay, because crying means you loved someone a lot. David cleared his throat, obviously moved by his daughter's observation. Why don't you girls go get dressed for the day? We can decide about the museum later. After the twins had thundered upstairs, leaving behind the kind of cheerful chaos that only children could create. David refilled Sarah's coffee and sat down across from her at the kitchen table. I hope they weren't too overwhelming, he said. They don't often get new people to interrogate, so they go a little overboard when they do. They're wonderful, Sarah said sincerely. You've done an incredible job raising them. They're confident and kind and so obviously loved. Rebecca did most of the heavy lifting in their early years, David admitted. I was working too much, traveling too often, thinking I had time to figure out how to be a better father. When she died, I had to learn everything from scratch. Sarah heard the self-criticism in his voice and recognized it as the kind of guilt that came from surviving when someone you loved hadn't. You're an amazing father, she said firmly. Anyone can see how happy and secure they are. David looked away, his jaw working. Their mother left when they were 6 months old. She was a rising actress. Melissa Hart. You might have heard of her. Sarah had. Everyone had. Melissa Hart was everywhere these days. Magazines, movies, award shows. She never wanted children. Dylan continued, his voice low. But birth control failed. And suddenly she was pregnant with triplets. She tried to make it work, but when they were 6 months old, she got a call about an audition, a big one, career-changing, and the girls were sick. I was at work. She had to choose, and she chose the audition. Sarah finished softly. She said she'd send money visit, but after a year even the calls stopped. Dylan's hands clenched. I don't resent her for choosing her dream, but I resent her for making them feel like they weren't enough. They don't feel that way. They know they're loved. Because of you. Dylan said, I made sure of that, but I've been terrified of bringing anyone into their lives. What if I choose wrong? What if someone else leaves and breaks their hearts? Dylan, Sarah said, stepping closer. I can't promise I won't make mistakes, but I can promise I know what it feels like to be left. And I'd never do that to someone else. He met her eyes, and for the first time all night, she saw the weight he carried. The fear, the hope. Jane was right, he said. You are special. So are you? Sierra whispered. They stood there, two people who'd been broken in different ways, recognizing something in each other that felt like the beginning of healing. Would you like to do this again properly? A real date. I'd love that, but fair warning, I might insist your daughters come along sometimes. They're kind of the best part of the package. Dylan laughed, and it was the sound of a man remembering what hope felt like. Sarah, can I tell you something? And I don't want it to change our arrangement or make things awkward, but I can't not say it anymore. Sarah's heart began to pound. Something in his tone, in the way he was looking at her, suggested that whatever he was about to say would shift the foundation of everything between them. Okay, she whispered. I've fallen in love with you, David said quietly. The words settling into the kitchen like stones dropped into still water. Not because you help with the kids, or because you've made my life easier, though you have, but because you're kind and strong and brave, because you came back from being told you were worthless and proved that wasn't true. Sarah felt her breath catch her entire world tilting on its axis. David Harrison, this good man who'd saved her from freezing to death, who'd given her a chance to rebuild her life, who'd showed her what real love looked like through his devotion to his daughters. He loved her. Because my children love you, and I trust their judgment completely. David continued, his brown eyes holding hers steadily. Because when I think about the future, I can't imagine it without you in it. Sarah felt tears streaming down her cheeks, emotions she'd tried so hard to suppress, breaking through every careful barrier she'd constructed. But I know this is complicated, David said quickly, holding up a hand. I know you're still recovering from your divorce, still rebuilding your life. I know there's a professional dynamic here that makes things murky. So I'm not asking for anything to change right now. I just needed you to know that you're important to me, that you matter not as an employee or a helper, but as someone I've come to care about deeply. Sarah wiped her eyes, trying to find words for the emotions threatening to overwhelm her. David, you don't have to say anything, David interrupted gently. I just wanted you to know where I stand, especially if we're going to be talking about moving across the country together. You should know that my feelings for you go far beyond professional appreciation. I love you too, Sarah whispered, the words escaping before she could second-guess them. David's face transformed, surprise and hope and joy chasing away the careful restraint he'd been maintaining. You do. I've been trying not to, Sarah admitted, laughing through her tears. I've been trying to keep it professional, trying to convince myself that what I was feeling was just gratitude or relief at being safe. But it's not. I love you, and I love Lily and Rose, and the thought of this family being scattered across different time zones makes me physically ill. David reached across the table and took her hand, his thumb tracing circles across her palm. So we go to San Francisco together, he said, making it sound like the simplest thing in the world. All four of us. A family adventure. Are you sure? Sarah asked, hardly daring to believe it could be so easy. It would mean sharing space, more intimately dealing with the complications of whatever this is between us, while also managing the girls and your work. Sarah, David said, his voice steady and sure. I've been a single parent for 2 years. I've figured out that the only thing that really matters is keeping the people I love close and safe and happy. Everything else is just logistics. Sarah felt something settle deep in her soul, a sense of rightness and belonging that she'd never experienced before. This man loved her, not despite her struggles, but including them. He saw her infertility not as a failure, but as simply one aspect of who she was. He valued her contribution to his family, not because she filled a convenient role, but because she'd brought her whole self to loving them. The girls, Sarah said, thinking practically even as her heart soared. How do we tell them about us, about what this means? David smiled, the expression transforming his entire face. We tell them that sometimes adults who care about each other decide to be more than friends. We tell them that nothing about their security or our love for them changes, and we let them help us figure out what comes next. As if summoned by their conversation, the sound of small feet on the stairs interrupted them. Lily appeared in the kitchen doorway, rubbing her eyes sleepily. I heard talking, she said, looking between Sarah and David, with the intuitive awareness that children brought to adult emotions. Are you guys okay? You look like you've been crying, Sarah. Happy tears, sweetheart, Sarah said, extending her arms to invite Lily over for a hug. We were talking about some big changes that might be coming. Lily climbed into Sarah's lap, snuggling against her chest with the easy affection that had developed between them over the past few months. Good changes or scary changes, both David said honestly. We might all get to go on an adventure together to San Francisco for a while. Lily perked up immediately. All of us. Even Sarah. Especially Sarah, David confirmed, his eyes meeting Sarah's over his daughter's head. We're a family, and families stick together. The next morning brought a flurry of practical conversations about the San Francisco opportunity, but underneath the logistics of school transfers and temporary housing, Sarah could feel the seismic shift that David's confession had created in their relationship. Everything looked the same. The same kitchen table where they planned the girls' schedules, the same routine of breakfast and backpack checking and goodbye kisses, but everything felt different. David's eyes lingered on her face when he thought she wasn't looking. Their hands brushed more often during ordinary tasks, and neither of them pulled away immediately. When he said goodbye before heading to his office for a morning conference call, there was a weight to it that hadn't been there before, an acknowledgement of feelings finally spoken aloud. The twins, with the supernatural intuition that children possessed for adult emotional undercurrents, seemed to sense that something significant had shifted. Dad seems happier today, Rose observed, as Sarah helped her pack her lunch for school. Like really happy. Not just regular happy. Maybe it's because he's excited about the work project, Sarah suggested, though she could feel heat creeping up her neck. Maybe Lily agreed from her perch at the breakfast counter. Or maybe it's because he likes you. Sarah nearly dropped the apple she was slicing. What do you mean? He looks at you the way people look at other people in movies when they're about to kiss them. Rose explained matter-of-factly. And you look at him the same way sometimes. Do you want him to kiss you? Lily asked with 8-year-old directness. Because I think it would be nice if he did. You make him smile more than he used to. Sarah felt completely out of her depth. How did one navigate romantic feelings with an audience of two extremely observant children who had opinions about everything and no sense of adult privacy? Your dad and I care about each other very much, Sarah said carefully. Just like we both care about you and Rose. But different Rose pressed, like the way Mom and Dad used to care about each other. The mention of Rebecca sent a pang through Sarah's chest. These girls were not just navigating their own feelings about Sarah's presence in their lives. They were processing how she fit into the memory of their mother, how love could expand and change without diminishing what had come before. Different. Yes, Sarah admitted. But that doesn't change how much we both love you or how important you are to both of us. We know that, Lily said with the patience of someone explaining something obvious to a slow adult. We just want to make sure you know that if Dad wants to kiss you, that's okay with us. And if you want to kiss him back, that's okay too, Rose added helpfully. Sarah laughed despite her nervousness. Thank you for the permission. I'll keep that in mind. After the girls left for school, Sarah found herself alone in the house for the first time since David's confession, free to process the enormous shift in their relationship without small ears, listening to every word. She moved through the familiar routine of tidying up breakfast dishes and starting a load of laundry, but her mind kept returning to the night before, to the look in David's eyes when he'd told her he loved her. She'd been honest when she'd told him she'd been trying not to fall in love with him. From the moment he'd rescued her from that bus stop, Sarah had been hyper-aware of the power imbalance in their relationship, of her dependence on his kindness and generosity. The last thing she'd wanted was to complicate their arrangement with romantic feelings that might not be reciprocated. But somewhere between helping with homework and managing evening routines, between watching David read bedtime stories and seeing him navigate single parenthood with such patient devotion, she'd stopped being able to pretend that her feelings were purely professional. David Harrison was everything Vincent Crawford had never been: kind, without expecting credit, strong, without being controlling, successful, without being cruel. He loved his daughters with a fierce protectiveness that never turned possessive. He made mistakes and apologized for them. He asked for help when he needed it, instead of pretending to be invincible. And somehow impossibly, he loved her. Around noon, David emerged from his office, looking frazzled and slightly overwhelmed. Crisis call with Peterson Global, he explained, accepting the coffee Sarah offered him gratefully. They want to move the timeline up. Instead of starting in March, they want us in San Francisco by February 1st. That's only 3 weeks away, Sarah said, her mind immediately racing through everything that would need to happen to make such a timeline work. I know, it's insane. I should probably tell them no, that we need more time to plan properly. David sat down at the kitchen island, rubbing his temples with the heels of his hands. But Sarah, the contract they're offering is even bigger than what we discussed. This could set the business up for years, could pay for the girls' college educations, could give us financial security that I've never been able to guarantee them. Sarah heard the longing in his voice, the conflict between practical opportunity and emotional concerns. But she prompted, "But 3 weeks isn't enough time to transition the girls properly, to find good temporary schools to help them adjust to the idea of leaving their friends and their routines." He looked up at her with eyes full of frustration. "And it's not fair to ask you to uproot your life with such short notice. You'd have to give up the college classes you were planning to start, abandon the life you're rebuilding here." Sarah felt something shift in her chest, a moment of absolute clarity about what mattered most to her. "David," she said quietly, "look at me." He raised his head, meeting her eyes across the kitchen island. 3 months ago I had nothing. No home, no family, no future that I could envision. You gave me all of that. She reached across the counter to take his hand. "The life I'm rebuilding here, it's not about Chicago or college classes or any specific location. It's about being part of your family. It's about loving you and Lily and Rose." David's grip on her hand tightened. "Sarah, let me finish," she said gently. "I know this is scary and rushed and probably crazy. But if we're talking about being a family, about building a future together, then we figure out how to make it work. All of us together, wherever we need to be." "You're sure?" David asked, his voice rough with emotion. "You're absolutely certain you want to tie your future to us, to this chaos, to the uncertainty of starting over in a new city?" Sarah thought about her answer carefully because she knew it would shape everything that came next. She thought about Vincent's cold dismissal, about sitting in that bus stop, convinced she was worthless, about the long journey from broken to beloved that had brought her to this moment. "I've never been more sure of anything," she said finally. "David, you and the girls aren't my plan B or my safe option. You're my first choice, my best choice, my always choice." David stood up from the stool and walked around the island to where Sarah was standing. Without hesitation, he cupped her face in his hands and kissed her soft and sure and full of all the feelings they'd been carefully avoiding for months. When they broke apart, both were crying. "I love you," David whispered against her forehead. "I love you so much it scares me sometimes." "Good scared or bad scared?" Sarah asked, echoing Lily's question from that morning. "Good scared," David assured her. "The kind of scared that comes from caring about something precious, from having something worth protecting." They stood there in the kitchen, holding each other, and planning a future that would have seemed impossible 6 months ago. Outside Chicago continued its busy rhythm, but inside their warm house, 2 people who'd found each other against all odds began mapping out the next chapter of their story. When the girls came home from school that afternoon, they found David and Sarah sitting close together at the kitchen table, surrounded by printouts of schools and housing options in San Francisco. "Are we really going to California?" Rose asked, dropping her backpack and climbing into David's lap. "We really are," David confirmed. "All 4 of us. For 6 months of adventure." "And when we come back?" Lily asked, always thinking ahead. Sarah and David exchanged a look full of promise and possibility. "When we come back," Sarah said, "we'll figure out what home looks like for our family." That evening, after the girls had gone to bed, chattering excitedly about San Francisco and the adventures that awaited them, David and Sarah found themselves alone in the living room, sharing the couch and the quiet intimacy that came with having finally acknowledged their feelings for each other. "I keep waiting for the other shoe to drop," Sarah admitted quietly, curled against David's side with his arm around her shoulders. "For you to realize that this is all happening too fast, that you're making a mistake." David's arm tightened around her. "What would make me realize that?" Sarah was quiet for a moment, trying to find words for the fears that had been growing louder since their kiss in the kitchen. "I can't give you more children," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "I can't expand your family or give Lily and Rose biological siblings. I can't be the woman who makes your legacy complete." She felt David's body tense beside her, but he didn't pull away. Instead, he shifted so he could look directly into her face. "Sarah," he said, his voice steady and firm. "Listen to me very carefully. I already have children. I have Lily and Rose, who are perfect and complete and everything I could ever want in daughters. I'm not looking for you to give me a family. I'm looking for you to share the family I already have." Sarah felt tears beginning to fall, months of suppressed fear and inadequacy, finally finding their voice. But Vincent was wrong about everything. David interrupted, his voice taking on an edge of anger that wasn't directed at her. "Vincent wanted you to be a vessel for his ambitions, instead of a partner in building a life together. Vincent never understood what it meant to actually love someone." David took her hands in both of his thumbs tracing gentle circles across her knuckles. "Sarah, do you remember what you said to me when I told you about Rebecca? About how I was doing an amazing job raising the girls alone?" Sarah nodded, not trusting her voice. "You saw that I was already a complete father, that I didn't need someone to come in and fix my parenting or make my family whole. You understood that I'd built something good with my daughters, that we were already a unit worth preserving and celebrating." He paused, making sure she was following his logic. "That's exactly how I see you. You're not broken or incomplete or lacking something essential. You're a whole person who has love to give and wisdom to share and so much to contribute to a family. The fact that your uterus doesn't work the way Vincent wanted it to work doesn't diminish your worth as a woman or as a partner or as anything else." Sarah was crying openly now, years of shame and self-doubt finally beginning to crack under the weight of David's unwavering acceptance. "But what if people ask why we don't have children together? What if they assume something's wrong with our relationship? Then they'll be making assumptions that aren't any of their business," David said simply. "Sarah, there are a million reasons why couples don't have biological children together. Some people choose not to. Some people struggle with infertility. Some people are older when they meet and decide they're content with the family they already have." He brushed tears from her cheeks with his thumbs. "What matters is what we decide together, what makes our family happy and healthy and whole. Not what other people think we should want or what they think we're missing." Sarah felt something fundamental shift inside her chest, a knot of shame and inadequacy that had been tightening for years finally beginning to loosen. "I love Lily and Rose," she said quietly. "I love them like they're my own daughters. They love you the same way David assured her. You've been more of a mother to them in these past few months than their biological mother was in their entire lives. Biology doesn't make families, Sarah. Choice does. Love does. Showing up every day and choosing to care for each other does." Sarah thought about the past few months, about homework help and bedtime stories, about worried nights when someone had a fever and celebratory afternoons when someone mastered a difficult math concept, about the way Lily sought her out for comfort when she was scared, and the way Rose included her in every important conversation. She thought about the family photos David had started taking, casual snapshots of their life together that now filled frames throughout the house. In every picture they looked like exactly what they were, a family bound by love rather than genetics, by choice rather than biology. "I want this," Sarah said, surprised by the strength in her own voice. "I want to build a life with you and the girls. I want to go to San Francisco as your partner, not just as your employee. I want to come home to Chicago as your girlfriend maybe someday, as your fiancée and your wife." David's face lit up with such joy that Sarah felt her breath catch. "You want that?" "Really, I want all of it," Sarah confirmed. "The chaos and the uncertainty and the bedtime stories and the school events and the teenage years and whatever comes after. I want to be part of this family in every way that matters." David kissed her then, deep and thorough and full of promise. When they broke apart, both were laughing through their tears. "The girls are going to be impossible when they find out we're officially together," David warned. "They've been planning our wedding since the second week you lived here." Sarah laughed, remembering Rose's matter-of-fact comments about kissing and Lily's innocent questions about whether Sarah was going to stay forever. "They've been planning our wedding. Rose picked out your dress," David informed her solemnly. "It's purple because that's her favorite color, and it has sparkles, because Lily says all important dresses should have sparkles." They've also chosen the menu, the flowers, and the music. What did they choose? Macaroni and cheese dandelions from the backyard, and the soundtrack from Moana. Sarah buried her face in David's shoulder, laughing so hard she could barely breathe. "That sounds perfect." "It really does," David agreed, pressing a kiss to the top of her head. "Though we might want to upgrade the venue from our backyard to somewhere with heating if we're going to do it in Chicago." The casual mention of their future wedding sent warmth flooding through Sarah's chest. Not the desperate, grasping hope she'd felt during her engagement to Vincent, but something steadier and more real. The quiet certainty that came from being truly seen and valued and loved. They spent the evening making plans for San Francisco, researching neighborhoods and schools, and discussing the logistics of moving cross-country with 2 children and a business that required constant attention. But underneath the practical conversations, Sarah could feel the shift in their dynamic, the way they now moved as true partners rather than just compatible housemates. When they finally headed upstairs, David walked her to the guest room that she'd called home for the past 3 months. "After San Francisco," he said quietly, his hand on her doorframe. "When we come back to Chicago, you won't need this room anymore. If you want, I mean. If you're ready for that step." Sarah thought about the guest room that had been her sanctuary, the place where she'd slowly pieced herself back together after Vincent's rejection. It had served its purpose, given her the space and safety she'd needed to remember who she was when she wasn't performing for someone else's approval. But she was ready now for something more, for the kind of intimacy and partnership that came with sharing not just a house, but a life. "When we come back from San Francisco," Sarah said, standing on her tiptoes to kiss him goodnight. "I want to share your room, your bed, your whole life. I'm ready for all of it." As she closed the guest room door behind her, Sarah caught sight of herself in the mirror above the dresser. The woman looking back at her bore little resemblance to the broken, desperate person who'd sat in that bus stop 6 months ago. This woman was confident, loved, secure in her place in the world. This woman was ready to build a future based on love instead of fear, on abundance instead of scarcity, on the radical idea that families were created by choice and sustained by commitment rather than biology. For the first time since Vincent had told her she was defective, Sarah went to sleep excited about tomorrow. The flight to San Francisco was chaos in the best possible way. Lily pressed her face against the airplane window for the entire journey, providing running commentary on cloud formations and ground patterns visible from 35,000 feet. Rose peppered the flight attendants with questions about aviation and engineering, until David gently suggested she save some for later. Sarah sat between the girls, answering questions and mediating the occasional disagreement, while David managed business calls and contract details from his aisle seat. To anyone observing their little group, they would have looked like exactly what they were, a family embarking on an adventure together, complete with the beautiful chaos that came with traveling with children. The house David had rented in Marin County was perfect for their temporary needs. A 4-bedroom craftsman with a view of the bay walking distance to a good elementary school and enough space for David to set up a home office that would allow him to manage both the Peterson Global contract and his other clients. "This is like a vacation house," Lily declared, running from room to room and claiming the bedroom with the best view for herself and Rose. "But we get to live here for 6 months," Sarah reminded her gently. "Then we go home to Chicago." "Will this feel like home too?" Rose asked, ever the practical one. "Or will it just feel like visiting?" It was a perceptive question from an 8-year-old, and Sarah found herself thinking about it as they unpacked their suitcases and began the process of making the rental house feel like theirs. What made a place feel like home? Was it familiar surroundings, or was it the people you shared space with? Within a week, Sarah had her answer. The house in Marin County felt like home because it was filled with the same love and laughter and daily routines that had defined their life in Chicago. David still worked from his office, emerging for coffee and quick conversations about the girls' school schedules. The twins still needed help with homework and bedtime stories. Sarah still managed the household rhythms that kept everything running smoothly. But there were new adventures too. Weekend trips to Muir Woods, where the girls marveled at redwood trees that made them feel like tiny woodland sprites. Visits to Fisherman's Wharf, where Rose became obsessed with the sea lions, and Lily discovered a love for sourdough bread. Family trips across the Golden Gate Bridge, which never failed to take Sarah's breath away. "It's like we're explorers," Lily announced one sunny Saturday as they hiked through Golden Gate Park. "Like we're discovering a new world together." "We are discovering a new world," David agreed, falling into step beside Sarah as the girls ran ahead to investigate an interesting tree. "All of us." The Peterson Global contract was everything David had hoped it would be. The project was challenging and complex, requiring all of his expertise in technology consulting, but it was also the kind of work that excited him professionally. Sarah watched him thrive in meetings with client executives, bringing creative solutions to problems they'd been struggling with for years. "You're really good at this," Sarah observed one evening after David had spent the day presenting a major proposal to the Peterson Global Board. "Not just competent, but genuinely gifted. You can see solutions that other people miss." David smiled, pulling her close on the couch where they'd been reading while the girls did puzzles on the living room floor. "Rebecca always said that my superpower was seeing patterns and connections that weren't obvious. She used to joke that I should have been a detective instead of a consultant." The mention of Rebecca's name no longer sent pangs of jealousy or inadequacy through Sarah's chest. Instead, she felt grateful for the woman who'd loved David first, who'd helped shape him into the man who was now building a future with her. "She sounds like she really understood you," Sarah said softly. "She did." "And she would have loved you," David replied with certainty that warmed Sarah from the inside out. "She would have loved how you care for the girls, how you've made our family feel complete again." The girls were thriving in their temporary school, making friends with the easy adaptability of children and throwing themselves into new experiences with enthusiasm. Rose joined the robotics club and came home every day with detailed explanations of engineering principles that made David beam with pride. Lily discovered that her new school had an art teacher who specialized in watercolor techniques, the medium Sarah had mentioned loving years ago. "Mrs. Rodriguez says I have natural talent," Lily announced proudly, showing Sarah her latest painting. "She says with practice I could be really good." "You already are really good, Sarah," assured her, studying the delicate flower painting with genuine admiration. "You see colors and shapes in ways that are uniquely yours." "Will you paint with me sometime?" Lily asked hopefully. "You said you used to love watercolors." Sarah felt a flutter of old anxiety. It had been years since she'd touched a paintbrush, years since Vincent had dismissed her artistic interests as frivolous hobbies that didn't contribute to their social standing or his business success. "I'm pretty rusty," Sarah warned. "I haven't painted in a very long time." "That's okay," Lily said with 8-year-old confidence. "We can learn together." That weekend, Sarah found herself sitting at the kitchen table with Lily and a set of watercolors, rediscovering the meditative joy of watching colors blend and flow on paper. Her first attempts were tentative, uncertain, but gradually she remembered the pleasure of creating something purely for the sake of beauty. "You're really good at this," Rose observed, looking over Sarah's shoulder at a landscape she'd painted from memory. "The view from David's backyard in Chicago." "Is that our house?" "It's the view from our backyard," Sarah confirmed. "I painted it because I miss it sometimes." "I miss it too," Lily agreed. "But I like it here also." "Is that okay?" "It's perfectly okay to love more than one place," Sarah assured her. "Hearts are big enough to hold lots of different kinds of love." David appeared in the doorway watching the impromptu art session with the expression Sarah had learned meant he was filing away mental pictures to treasure later. What do you think Sarah asked, holding up her painting for his inspection? I think David said, kissing the top of her head as he passed, that you're remembering who you were before someone convinced you to hide your light. The simple observation hit Sarah with unexpected force. She was remembering who she'd been before Vincent had drawn her deeper into his isolated world. She was rediscovering parts of herself that had been buried under years of trying to be someone else's idea of perfect. That night, after the girls were asleep and David had finished his evening calls with Chicago clients, they sat on the deck overlooking the bay, sharing wine and the quiet satisfaction of a day well spent. I've been thinking, Sarah said, watching the lights of San Francisco twinkle in the distance. About what? About what happens when we go back to Chicago. About what I want to do with my life beyond helping you manage your household. David turned to look at her, his expression encouraging. And what do you want to do? I think I want to go back to school, Sarah said slowly, the idea gaining strength as she spoke it aloud. Maybe study art therapy or counseling, something that combines creativity with helping people heal from difficult experiences. That's perfect, David said immediately. You'd be incredible at that. You have such intuitive understanding of what people need, and you've certainly navigated your own healing journey. Sarah felt a flutter of excitement, the same feeling she'd had as a teenager when she'd dreamed about college and careers and making a difference in the world. Those dreams had been put on hold during her marriage to Vincent, but maybe it wasn't too late to reclaim them. It would mean more school, probably a master's degree. Sarah said, it would be expensive and time-consuming, and I'd be starting over professionally in my 30s. So David said with a smile, I'll support you however I can. We'll figure out the logistics together. That's what partners do. Partners. The word sent warmth flooding through Sarah's chest. Not just girlfriend or live-in helper, but true partner in building a life and pursuing dreams and supporting each other's growth. As they sat together under the California stars, making plans for a future that was both practical and ambitious, Sarah realized that she wasn't just rebuilding her life anymore. She was actively creating the life she'd always wanted, but had been afraid to believe was possible. A life based on love instead of fear, on possibility instead of limitation, on the radical belief that it was never too late to become who you were meant to be. 3 months into their San Francisco adventure, David made a decision that would transform their temporary arrangement into something permanent and beautiful. The Peterson Global contract was exceeding all expectations, with client executives already discussing extending the partnership and potentially opening a West Coast branch of Harrison Tech Solutions. But more importantly, their family was thriving in ways that had nothing to do with business success. Sarah had found her rhythm in this new city building, friendships with other parents at the girls' school, and discovering a vibrant community of artists and creatives who welcomed her watercolor experimentation with enthusiasm. She'd even started teaching informal art classes to some of the neighborhood children, watching their confidence bloom as they learned to express themselves through color and form. The twins were flourishing academically and socially, bringing home stories about new friends and exciting projects, with the kind of enthusiasm that spoke of genuine happiness rather than polite adjustment. They'd stopped asking when they were going back to Chicago and started talking about San Francisco as if it might become a permanent second home. And David had fallen in love with Sarah all over again, watching her confidence grow and her natural talents emerge as she carved out space for her own interests and ambitions alongside their family life. I have something I want to show you, David announced one Saturday evening after they'd returned from a family trip to the California Academy of Sciences. The girls were upstairs in their shared bedroom building elaborate structures with the blocks they'd bought in the museum gift shop, and the house was filled with the comfortable sounds of children at play. What kind of something? Sarah asked, settling beside him on the couch, where they'd spent countless evenings planning their days and sharing their thoughts. David pulled out his phone and opened a text message thread with a number Sarah didn't recognize. Read this, he said, handing her the phone. The message was from a jewelry designer in Union Square, confirming an appointment for the following Tuesday at 2 to view custom engagement ring designs. Sarah's breath caught her heart, beginning to race as the implications sank in. David, what? I know we've only been officially together for a few months, David said quickly, taking her hands in his. And I know we agreed to take things slowly and see how everything developed. But Sarah, I don't want to wait any more to make this official. Sarah felt tears beginning to gather in her eyes, emotions she'd been carefully managing, threatening to overflow. I've been carrying this appointment around for 2 weeks trying to figure out the right time to bring it up. David continued, his voice gaining confidence as he spoke. But then today, watching you help Lily work through her frustration with that science exhibit, seeing Rose automatically reach for your hand when she got scared during the planetarium show. I realized I was overthinking everything. He shifted on the couch so he was facing her directly, his brown eyes serious and warm. Sarah, you're not my backup plan or my consolation prize or my convenient solution to single parenthood. You're my first choice, my best choice, my always choice. You're the person I want to build a future, with the person I want to grow old, with the person I want beside me, for every adventure and challenge and ordinary Tuesday that comes next. Sarah was crying openly now, overwhelmed by the depth of feeling in his voice and the certainty in his expression. I love you, David said simply. And I love the way Lily and Rose light up when you walk into a room. I love how you've made our family feel complete without trying to replace anyone or change anything fundamental about who we are. I love that you chose us, and I want to spend the rest of my life choosing you back. David, Sarah whispered, hardly daring to believe this was really happening. Will you marry me? He asked, the words settling into the living room like a benediction. Will you let me love you officially and permanently? Will you let us be your family in every way that matters? Sarah thought about the journey that had brought them to this moment, from that frozen bus stop to this warm California living room, from complete desperation to a love so deep and steady it took her breath away. She thought about Lily's art projects taped to their refrigerator and Rose's mathematical discoveries celebrated with family dance parties. She thought about David's patient devotion and the way he'd shown her that love could be safe and generous and utterly without conditions. Yes, she said, laughing through her tears. Yes, of course, yes. David kissed her then, soft and thorough and full of promise, and from upstairs they heard the sound of 2 little girls cheering. Were they listening? Sarah asked, breaking away from the kiss with a laugh. Probably, David admitted. They've been not so subtly asking when I was going to propose for weeks. Rose has been leaving wedding planning magazines on my desk, and Lily drew us a picture of our wedding that she hid in my briefcase. They drew our wedding, complete with the purple dress and dandelion bouquet they selected months ago, David confirmed. Though I think we might want to make some slight modifications to their vision. The girls appeared in the living room as if summoned, still in their pajamas, but wide awake with excitement. Did she say yes? Rose demanded immediately. Did you ask her properly? Lily added with 8-year-old concern for romantic protocol. She said yes, David confirmed, pulling both girls onto the couch for a family hug. And yes, I asked her properly. Can we call you Mom now? Lily asked Sarah directly, her voice hopeful but careful. Sarah felt her breath catch, the question hitting her with unexpected force. These children who had lost their first mother, and who had every reason to be protective of that memory, were offering her the most precious title they had to give. If you want to, Sarah said quietly. If it feels right to you. It feels right, Rose declared with characteristic certainty. You take care of us like a mom. You love us like a mom. You should be our mom. But will you remember our first mom too? Lily asked with the sensitivity that made her such a thoughtful child. Always, Sarah promised. I'll help you remember everything good about her, and I'll love you because of her love too, not instead of it. The 4 of them sat together on the couch, a tangle of arms and laughter and tears and joy, while outside the California sun set over the bay, and inside their temporary house felt more like home than anywhere Sarah had ever been. When are we going to have the wedding? Rose asked practically. When we get back to Chicago, David said. So all our friends can be there, and so we can get married where our family started. Can we help plan it? Lily asked hopefully. You can help plan everything, Sarah assured her. After all, it's your family too. That night, after the girls had finally settled into sleep, despite their excitement, David and Sarah sat together on their deck, overlooking the bay, making plans for an engagement ring and a wedding and a future that felt both carefully planned and beautifully spontaneous. "Are you sure about this?" Sarah asked quietly. "About all of it. The marriage and the commitment and tying your life to mine permanently." David took her hand, threading their fingers together with the easy intimacy that had developed between them. "Sarah," he said, his voice steady and certain. "6 months ago you were a stranger who needed help. Now you're the person I can't imagine living without. You're not a risk I'm taking. You're the safest bet I've ever made." The return to Chicago in late August felt like coming home in the truest sense, but it was different from the homecoming Sarah had expected. The house in Lincoln Park was exactly as they'd left it, but everything felt new because everything was new. Sarah wasn't returning as David's employee or temporary guest. She was coming home as his fiancée, as Lily and Rose's future stepmother, as a permanent member of the Harrison family. The engagement ring David had chosen with the help of the San Francisco jewelry designer was perfect in its simplicity. A classic solitaire diamond in a platinum setting that caught the light beautifully but never got in the way of daily tasks like helping with homework or painting watercolors or braiding little girls' hair for school. "It's so pretty." Lily sighed dramatically every time she caught sight of it. "When I get married, I want one exactly like that. When you get married, you'll choose whatever ring makes you happy," Sarah replied, but she was secretly pleased that her future stepdaughter approved of David's selection. The wedding planning began almost immediately, though planning might have been too strong a word for what was actually a delightful collaboration between 2 adults and 2 very opinionated 8-year-olds. "Small ceremony," David said during their first official planning session at the kitchen table. "Close friends and family. Maybe 40 people total. Backyard reception?" Sarah added. "Nothing too formal or intimidating. Just celebration and good food." Purple decorations Rose contributed firmly, and sparkly lights everywhere. "And a cake that looks like a flower garden," Lily said dreamily, "with butterflies made of sugar." David and Sarah exchanged amused glances. Their daughter's vision of the perfect wedding was enthusiastic, if not entirely practical, but the underlying sentiment was perfect joy, beauty, family, and celebration. The guest list was easier to compile than Sarah had expected. David's parents, who lived in Denver, were thrilled about the wedding and had already made arrangements to fly in early to help with preparations. His sister and her family would drive up from Milwaukee. The core group of neighbors and friends who had supported David through Rebecca's death and the challenging early years of single parenthood were eager to celebrate this new chapter. For Sarah, the list was shorter, but no less meaningful. Her cousin Lisa, finally back from her extended European travels, had cried with joy when Sarah called to share the news. A few colleagues from her volunteer work with an art therapy program she'd joined after returning from San Francisco. The small but significant community she'd built around her new life. "It's perfect," Sarah told David one evening as they finalized the catering menu and seating arrangements. "Not too big, not too small. Just the people who really matter to us." The ceremony would be held in the backyard under the old oak tree that Lily and Rose had claimed as their fairy tree, decorated with simple white flowers and the sparkly lights the girls had insisted upon. The reception would flow seamlessly into the same space, with round tables scattered across the lawn and a small dance floor that David's brother-in-law was constructing as his wedding gift to them. Sarah had found her dress at a small boutique in Wicker Park, an elegant A-line design in soft ivory silk that was beautiful without being overly formal, sophisticated, without being intimidating. The girls had been with her when she found it, and their enthusiastic approval had sealed the decision. "You look like a princess," Lily had declared with authority, "but also like yourself, which is even better." 2 weeks before the wedding, David's parents arrived for their extended visit, and Sarah found herself nervous in a way she hadn't expected. These were Rebecca's in-laws as well as David's parents. They had loved his first wife and been devastated by her death. How would they feel about the woman who was taking her place? She needn't have worried, Margaret and Robert Harrison were warm and gracious, welcoming Sarah into their family with genuine affection and obvious relief that their son had found love again. "We've been so worried about him," Margaret confided to Sarah during a quiet moment while they worked together in the kitchen, preparing dinner for the extended family gathering. "He was so devoted to Rebecca, and after she died, we weren't sure he'd ever allow himself to love anyone else." "It wasn't easy for either of us," Sarah admitted. "We both had walls to break down." "Well, whatever you two did, it worked," Margaret said warmly. "I haven't seen David this happy since before Rebecca got sick. And the girls absolutely worship you." "I worship them back," Sarah said honestly. "They've made me braver than I ever thought I could be." The final week before the wedding was a whirlwind of last-minute details and excited preparation. The girls tried on their flower girl dresses daily, practicing walking slowly and scattering rose petals with appropriate dramatic flair. David managed his work responsibilities, while also coordinating with vendors and helping Sarah handle the stream of well-wishes and small crises that seemed to accompany any celebration. The night before the wedding, Sarah found herself unable to sleep. Not from nervousness, but from pure excitement. Tomorrow she would officially become Sarah. Harrison would legally become Lily and Rose's stepmother, would publicly commit to building a future with the man who had saved her life by offering her kindness when she had nothing left. She thought about Vincent's cruel dismissal about sitting in that bus stop, convinced she was worthless about the long journey from broken to beloved that had brought her to this moment. Every painful step had been necessary to get here to this place of complete love and acceptance and joy. Tomorrow she would marry David Harrison, not because she needed rescuing, but because she'd chosen to build a life with someone who saw her as complete and valuable and essential. Tomorrow she would become part of a family that had chosen her back, just as enthusiastically. Tomorrow everything would be official. But really, Sarah knew they'd been a family from the very first night she'd stayed for dinner. 5 years later, the Harrison house had evolved into something that perfectly reflected the family who lived there. The walls were covered with Lily's artwork watercolor paintings that had grown increasingly sophisticated as she'd developed her natural talent, and Rose's academic achievements, including certificates from robotics competitions and science fairs, that filled David with pride. Sarah's art therapy practice had grown from a tentative exploration to a thriving business that specialized in helping women and children process trauma and loss. Her office in downtown Chicago was warm and welcoming, filled with art supplies and comfortable seating, and the kind of gentle energy that made people feel safe to be vulnerable. "You saved my life," clients told her regularly, and Sarah always smiled and reminded them that they'd saved themselves. She'd simply provided the space and tools for their own healing. But privately, Sarah understood the sentiment completely. She remembered what it felt like to believe you were broken beyond repair, to think your worth was tied to functions your body couldn't perform, to feel discarded and worthless and utterly alone. Her work with other women facing similar struggles felt like the most meaningful thing she'd ever done. David's business had expanded beyond his wildest dreams. The success of the San Francisco contract had led to a permanent West Coast office and partnerships with major tech companies across the country. He traveled more now, but never for more than a few days at a time, and never without extensive coordination with Sarah to make sure the girls' routines remained stable and supported. "We're a team," he reminded clients who pushed for longer engagements. "My family is my priority, and my business serves that priority, not the other way around." The girls, now 13 and navigating the complex social landscape of middle school, had grown into confident, compassionate teenagers who served as a testament to the power of consistent love and support. Lily's artistic talents had earned her a spot in an advanced program at the Art Institute, and Rose's engineering aptitude had led to a mentorship with a robotics team at Northwestern University. They called Sarah Mom without hesitation or qualification, and they spoke about their biological mother with love and respect, while fully embracing the woman who had chosen to love them daily. "I don't understand why some people think kids can only have one mom," Rose had declared recently during a family dinner conversation about different types of families. We had Mum Rebecca first, who loved us and gave birth to us, and now we have Mum Sarah, who loves us and takes care of us. We're just lucky we got two good ones instead of just one. The anniversary of Rebecca's death was still observed every year, but it had evolved from a day of pure grief to something more complex and healing. The family visited her grave together, sharing stories and memories, acknowledging the sadness of her absence, while also celebrating the love that continued to shape their lives. She would be so proud of all of you, Sarah would tell the girls each year. She would love the young women you're becoming, and she would be happy that you've had all the love and support you needed to grow up feeling secure and valued. Sarah's own relationship with loss had evolved as well. She'd made peace with her infertility, understanding finally that her worth as a woman and as a mother had nothing to do with her body's reproductive capabilities. The children she was meant to love had found her in a different way, and that love was no less real or meaningful for being chosen rather than biological. The community that surrounded their family had grown and deepened over the years. Sarah's art therapy practice had connected her with other professionals who became both colleagues and friends. David's business success had brought opportunities to mentor younger entrepreneurs and give back to the community that had supported them. Their home had become a gathering place for holidays and celebrations filled with laughter and good food and the kind of warmth that made everyone feel welcome. Extended family, close friends, neighbors, and clients often found themselves around the Harrison dinner table, part of the chosen family that Sarah and David had built through years of intentional love and care. "You've created something special here," David's mother had observed during her most recent visit. "This house feels like home to everyone who enters it." Sarah understood what she meant. The house in Lincoln Park had become more than just where they lived. It had become a refuge and a celebration. A place where broken things were healed and where love multiplied rather than diminished when it was shared. On quiet evenings when the girls were upstairs doing homework and David was catching up on emails, Sarah would sit in their living room and marvel at the life they'd built together. Not despite the pain they'd all experienced, but including it, integrating it, allowing it to inform their capacity for compassion and gratitude. They'd all been broken in different ways, but together they'd become something beautiful and whole. The Charity Gala was one of Chicago's premier social events held annually to benefit children's educational programs throughout the city. Sarah and David attended every year, both as supporters of the cause and as representatives of David's company, which had become a major donor to educational technology initiatives. This particular evening, Sarah was wearing a navy blue dress that made her feel confident and elegant, and David looked distinguished in his black tuxedo. At 34 and 39 respectively, they moved through the crowded ballroom with the ease of people who had found their place in the world and were comfortable occupying it. Sarah was engaged in a conversation with the director of an after-school arts program when she noticed David's posture suddenly change beside her. He'd gone still in a way that usually indicated some kind of trouble, and Sarah followed his gaze across the room to see what had caused the reaction. Vincent Crawford stood near the bar, older and somehow diminished from the man Sarah remembered. His hair was thinning, his face showing signs of stress and dissatisfaction that aging alone couldn't account for. Beside him stood a woman who couldn't have been more than 25, visibly pregnant, and looking uncomfortable in the formal setting. Sarah David's voice was quiet but alert. "Do you want to leave?" Sarah studied her ex-husband for a moment, waiting for some emotional response to surface. Anger, perhaps, or hurt, or the old familiar shame. Instead, she felt something like curiosity and unexpectedly added, "No," she said quietly. "I'm okay. He can't hurt me anymore." Vincent noticed them at almost the same moment, his eyes widening with surprise and something that might have been embarrassment. For a moment he seemed to consider approaching, then obviously thought better of it. But 20 minutes later, when Sarah was alone at their table while David spoke with a potential client, Vincent appeared beside her. "Hello, Sarah," he said, his voice carefully neutral. "Hello, Vincent," she replied calmly. Up close, the signs of dissatisfaction were even more apparent. He looked like a man who had achieved everything he'd thought he wanted and found it lacking. "You look well," he said awkwardly. "Happy." "I am happy," Sarah confirmed simply. "Very happy." Vincent's gaze moved to her left hand, taking in the wedding ring and engagement ring that caught the light as she reached for her water glass. "You remarried?" "I did. To a wonderful man with 2 beautiful daughters." Sarah's voice held no malice, just simple truth. "Children," Vincent repeated, and something flicked across his face. Pain, perhaps, or regret? "Yes," Sarah said evenly. "It turns out that loving children and being loved by them has nothing to do with biology. It's about showing up, being present, choosing each other every single day." Vincent was quiet for a moment, his hands fidgeting with his drink. "Sarah, I need you to know what I said that day, how I handled things. It was wrong, cruel. I was scared and selfish, and I took it out on you." Sarah felt surprise at the apology she'd never expected to receive. "Thank you for saying that. I appreciate it." "I made a mistake." Vincent continued the words, seeming to cost him considerable effort. "The biggest mistake of my life, probably." Sarah looked at him. Really looked, and saw not the powerful, confident man who had once made her feel worthless, but someone who had spent years learning the difference between getting what you want and being happy. "How is your wife?" Sarah asked gently, nodding toward the young woman who was now sitting alone at Vincent's table, looking tired and slightly overwhelmed. "Pregnant with our 3rd child," Vincent said, but there was no joy in his voice. 2 boys already ages 3 and 2. "That must be wonderful," Sarah said, though something in his tone suggested otherwise. "It should be." Vincent admitted his mask of composure slipping slightly. "I got everything I said I wanted. Biological children, a young wife. The family legacy I thought was so important." He paused, his voice growing quiet. "But it turns out that having children and being a father are very different things, and building a family requires more than just reproduction." Sarah felt a pang of sympathy for the young woman across the room, probably dealing with 2 toddlers and a difficult pregnancy, while married to a man who clearly hadn't learned how to be truly present for the people he claimed to love. "I'm sorry you're not happy," Sarah said, meaning it. "I hope you figure out how to be better for them." "You were always too good for me," Vincent said quietly. "I just didn't know how to appreciate what I had." David appeared at Sarah's shoulder, then his presence immediately protective but not aggressive. "Everything all right here?" "Yes," Sarah said, standing up and taking David's hand. Vincent was just leaving. Vincent looked between them, taking in David's obvious concern for Sarah and the way she leaned into his support without hesitation. "Take care of yourself, Sarah," he said, and for the first time in their entire conversation, his voice held genuine warmth. "You deserve all the happiness you've found." As he walked away, returning to his young wife and his complicated life, Sarah felt David's arm tighten around her waist. "You okay?" he asked quietly. "I'm perfect," Sarah said, meaning it completely. "I just realized something I've never fully understood before." "What's that?" Sarah watched Vincent help his wife stand from her chair, saw the careful politeness between them that spoke of obligation rather than affection, and felt profound gratitude for the life she'd built instead. "He didn't reject me," she said slowly, the realization settling into her bones like truth. "He rejected the possibility of real love, real partnership, real family. He chose fear and control and shallow connections. I got the better deal by far." David kissed her temple softly. "Yes, you did. We all did." The applause in Northside Academy's auditorium was thunderous as Lily and Rose Harrison walked across the stage to receive their high school diplomas. Sarah sat in the front row between David and his parents, tears streaming down her face as she watched her daughters, for they were fully, completely her daughters. Now accept the recognition for 4 years of hard work and achievement. Lily graduated with honors from the Arts Academy, track her portfolio of paintings and mixed media work, earning her early admission to the Art Institute of Chicago. Rose had completed the Engineering Academy program while also serving as student body president, her college-bound plans, including a full scholarship to MIT and a summer internship with NASA. I can't believe they're really graduating. Margaret? Harrison whispered to Sarah as the ceremony continued. It feels like yesterday that you were helping them with elementary school homework. Sarah smiled through her tears, remembering those early days when homework help had been part of her job description rather than a labor of love. Now watching Lily and Rose prepare to launch into their adult lives, she felt the deep satisfaction that came from having been part of raising remarkable human beings. The ceremony concluded with the traditional cap throwing, and then families flooded onto the football field for pictures and celebrations. Sarah found herself surrounded by her daughters and their friends, everyone chattering excitedly about college plans and summer adventures. Mom, Lily said, approaching Sarah with a folded piece of paper in her hand. I have something for you. Sarah opened the paper to find a watercolor painting, a beautiful rendering of their family sitting around the kitchen table, warm light streaming through the windows, faces turned toward each other with obvious love and contentment. I painted it for my senior project, Lily explained. The assignment was to create something that represented the most important influence in your life. Sarah breathed, studying the painting with wonder. Every detail was perfect, from David's expression of concentration as he helped Rose with a math problem to Sarah's hands, braiding Lily's hair while she read a book. Read the back, Rose instructed, appearing at Sarah's other shoulder. Sarah flipped the painting over to find Lily's artist's statement written in careful calligraphy. The most important influence in my life has been my mom, Sarah, who taught me that families are created by choice and sustained by love. She showed me that being thrown away by one person doesn't determine your worth, and that sometimes the most beautiful things grow from the most difficult circumstances. She never tried to replace our first mom, but instead helped us understand that hearts are big enough to hold many different kinds of love. She made our house feel like home again, not by changing who we were, but by loving who we already were. Most importantly, she taught me that art, like love, has the power to transform pain into beauty. Sarah was crying openly now, overwhelmed by the depth of feeling in her daughter's words, and the recognition that she had somehow managed to love these children in exactly the way they needed to be loved. Sarah, David said softly, appearing beside her with a program from the ceremony. You need to hear Lily's speech. What speech? She's the valedictorian, Rose said proudly. She's speaking at the reception tonight. The evening reception was held in the school's main gymnasium, decorated with flowers and fairy lights that transformed the space into something magical. Faculty, families, and graduates mingled over dinner while a string quartet played softly in the background. When it came time for Lily's valedictorian address, Sarah found herself holding her breath as her daughter approached the podium with poise and confidence that made her heart swell with pride. 18 years ago, Lily began her voice clear and strong. Rose and I were born to parents who loved us completely. When we were 6, our mom, Rebecca, died in a car accident, and our world fell apart. For 2 years, Dad tried to be everything we needed, and he did an amazing job, but we were all just surviving, not really living. Sarah felt David's hand find hers under the table as Lily continued. Then one night, Dad rescued a woman from a bus stop during a snowstorm. Sarah Mitchell was broken and lost, and convinced she had nothing to offer the world. She'd been told she wasn't enough, that she was defective, that she had failed at the most basic function of being a woman. The gymnasium had gone completely silent, every person hanging on Lily's words. But Sarah didn't stay broken. She put herself back together piece by piece while helping our family heal at the same time. She became our mom, not because she replaced anyone, but because she chose us every single day, and we chose her back. Lily paused, her eyes finding Sarah in the crowd. Sarah taught me the most important lesson I'll ever learn, that our worth isn't determined by what we can or can't do, by what we look like, or by what our bodies are capable of. Our worth is determined by how we love, how we show up for people, how we turn our pain into compassion for others. The applause that followed was sustained and emotional, but Sarah barely heard it. She was too busy crying, too overwhelmed by the recognition that these children, Her children had understood and internalized every lesson she'd tried to teach them about resilience and love and the power of choosing family. As the reception wound down and families began to say their goodbyes, Sarah found herself surrounded by Lily and Rose's classmates and their parents, many of whom she'd known for years through school events and activities. "Thank you," a mother Sarah had worked with on numerous fundraisers, said quietly, "for showing our kids what it looks like to rebuild after loss, to choose love over fear, to create family in ways that have nothing to do with biology, and for raising two of the most compassionate, confident young women any of us have ever met," added another parent. "They're going to change the world." Later that night, after the celebrations were over and the girls had finally gone to bed, Sarah and David sat in their backyard under the oak tree where they'd been married 5 years earlier. "Are you proud of them?" David asked, though the question was unnecessary. Sarah's pride had been evident in every moment of the evening. "I'm proud of all of us," Sarah replied, leaning against David's shoulder and looking up at the stars. "We took all that brokenness, all that loss and pain and uncertainty, and we built something beautiful from it." David pressed a kiss to the top of her head. "Rebecca would be proud too. Of them, of you, of the family we've all created together." Sarah thought about the woman whose love had shaped David and the girls before she'd ever met them, and felt nothing but gratitude for the foundation Rebecca had provided. "I think she'd be happy that they never forgot her, but they also never stopped growing," Sarah said quietly. "She'd be proud that they learned to love without limits, to choose joy, even after experiencing loss." As they sat together in the peaceful darkness, Sarah reflected on the journey that had brought them all to this moment. From that frozen bus stop to this warm backyard, from complete desperation to a love so deep and steady it could support everyone it touched. She'd been thrown away because someone couldn't see her worth, but that rejection had led her to people who not only saw her value, but celebrated it daily. She'd been told she was incomplete, but she'd learned that wholeness had nothing to do with reproductive capacity, and everything to do with the ability to love and be loved. Most importantly, she'd discovered that the most beautiful families weren't necessarily the ones formed by biology, but the ones built by choice, sustained by commitment, and strengthened by the willingness to heal together. 10 years later, Sarah Harrison stood at the window of her art therapy center, watching the Chicago skyline shimmer in the afternoon light. At 44, she had built a life she could never have imagined during that desperate night at the bus stop 15 years ago. The center served dozens of women each month, offering healing and hope to those who'd been told they were broken, worthless, or incomplete. On the wall hung Lily's original watercolor painting of their family, now a reminder to every client that beautiful things could grow from the most difficult circumstances. Rose had graduated from MIT and was working on sustainable engineering solutions for developing countries. Lily owned a successful art gallery that showcased emerging artists while also offering community art therapy programs. Both women called Sarah every Sunday, their conversations filled with professional updates, relationship stories, and the comfortable intimacy of daughters who knew they were completely loved. David's business had grown into a national consulting firm, but he'd never forgotten the lesson that family came first. Their empty nest years were filled with travel community involvement and the quiet satisfaction of knowing they'd raised good humans who were making the world better. Sometimes being thrown away is exactly what leads you home. Sometimes the person who saves you is the one you never expected. Friends, if this story touched your heart, please don't let it end here. Hit that subscribe button and join our family for more stories that remind us that broken doesn't mean beyond repair, that love finds a way, and that families are built by choice, not just biology. Share this story with someone who needs to remember that their worth isn't determined by what their body can or can't do, but by how they love and show up for others. Drop a heart in the comments if you believe in second chances and the power of chosen family. Remember, you are never broken, just waiting for the right person to see your complete worth. Your story isn't over. Sometimes the most beautiful chapters are still being written. Thank you for being part of our community. Until next time, keep believing in the power of kindness. Hope and love that chooses to see possibility where others see only loss.